My name is Steve Westgarth, and this is the Engineering Leader. Today on the Engineering Leader, I'm joined by Chris Roberts, CEO at Nimble Approach. Chris is passionate about agile ways of working and is a strong proponent of building cross-functional teams. Chris has worked as Agile Delivery Lead at team level, as an Agile Coach leading transformations, and has also set up an Agile Development Hub for the Home Office. He now, through his own consultancy, Nimble Approach, helps organizations with digital transformation, embracing agility and delivery value to customers. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on the Engineering Leader today.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
So, Chris, I want to kick off by reading you a quote. So the quote is, "Agile as we know it today hasn't fixed our ongoing problems. It never will. It was never meant to do that." That actually came from a blog by Miljan Bajak back in 2020. And He argues that Agile is a little bit like cooking. If you follow the recipe, you should get a repeatable result. But if you really want to be a Michelin star chef, you need a bit of unique style, a bit of unique flair, and some innovation. In much the same way, it could be argued that truly high-performing teams can't just follow the recipe. So as an advocate of agile ways of working and embedding agile into organizations, what do you think to that?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I'm familiar with this blog, actually. Yeah, so I think what he's actually getting at was, I think there are a lot of basics to understand a new way of working. Agile as a movement was never been meant to be the same every organization. Every organization is different, got different environments, circumstances, challenges, even different cultures. I think he's talking about the basics to understand a way of working, are needed as a first step. But I think a lot of transformations maybe look at that as just a rinse and repeat way of working, where you need to try something small first, in my opinion, before it scales. Find out what works, understand something basic like a Scrum or an XP or a Kanban, but then also be able to tailor it and customize to your own organization and ways of working. I think every methodology that's been defined has probably started at one organization, like a Scrum at a Microsoft, maybe at mid-90s, but they've got to be tailored because no organization is the same. There's no just, as I say, rinse and repeat method, and it's finding what works for you and adding the flair. For sure, once the basics are in place and you understand it and that's bedded in a little bit, you find out what works, what doesn't. Adding the flair really separates those that can be effective, and probably separates those that maybe do transformations that are just paying lip service or a bit of an exercise. It's probably laggards now, right? Because I think we're quite a long way into the movement.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, so I've had experience from both ends of the spectrum. So I've worked in startup organizations where we've literally had one Scrum team, working as a team to get something done, delivering incremental value to our customers. You're on a repeatable basis. You every 2 weeks, 2 week sprints, making sure value goes out on a regular basis. And I've also worked in large corporate organizations that have got quite cumbersome waterfall processes kind of in place that are full of procedure and process that's very deeply entrenched into the organization, and the organization's trying to move towards a more agile way of thinking. And it's interesting because I think in both constructs you actually have challenges with how to work and how to, if I almost put in inverted commas, be agile. And so much of that for me is about understanding what agile actually is. And we go back to the Jeff Sutherland book, for example, the how to do twice the work in half the time. And that was probably my first exposure to agile, or to kind of to what a different way of working really would be. But I guess that the question would be, what makes that agile? Why does agile have to conform to something like that? Surely this is just a set of good practices or things that kind of work that people can apply in different contexts. So what does it mean to be agile?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, basically getting value hands of users, pretty quickly to validate your assumptions. Have we got it right? So that bite-sized chunk of value, that earliest testable product, to get out there to say, have we got it right? Do we need to pivot? Getting something in the hands of users and being able to then iterate, but based on a working product that's delivering value to users. I imagine getting return on investment. Trialing something in the market quickly. I think it's interesting you mentioned around. I've also worked in a range of environments. Startups, scale-ups, corporates. I think in a startup world, there's a bit of a myth about, but sometimes the day-to-day working of being agile is how it's referred to when there's just absolute, chaos, and actually they are craving a bit more structure. I think corporate world, it's trying to get sometimes rid of that almost like institutionalized, entrenched, bloated governance structure, processes and ways of working that may be too siloed. And I think back to, blank canvas, you're just trying to get value in the hands of end users quickly, and validate if you've got it right, because until you've done that, you don't know, right?
How important do you think it is to follow an established process and to conform to what would now be seen as agile good practice?
I don't know about conforming to an established process. I think people talk about Scrum, for example, is still a pretty, it fits together well, and there's a nice penny drop moment for people trying to adopt it on the cadence it runs and the different events, but it's still pretty loose framework. I mean, like Scrum was often combined with a lot of XP practices, which just became good modern day software engineering, right? Because I think it gave a framework to actually have some structure around doing the work, but it wasn't didn't have sort of detailed processes on how to do the work. And I think that's where you can combine things with like an XP, or I guess you can combine things now, like a Scrum framework with design sprints, or a lot of validated learning stuff from lean startups. So I think it's important for a team to define a way of working that doesn't have to be a crazily granular process. That can be something that if they do define a process, I think it's important they do that. But a V1 definition of a process, if that doesn't change, I think within 2 weeks of it happening, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, I think there still needs to be that mentality of, if that doesn't change, that's a bit of a smell as well, because that, are they feeding back regularly? Have they got that loop and that mechanism to change and can things that don't work or amend it slightly or pivot?
I think the thing for me is, if you're absolutely right, your teams do need to change and evolve and improve, but that there is a certain benefit of starting with a known pattern, and
Yeah,
then as you evolve and learn and improve, actually you're choosing what you're actually testing. So if you want to experiment by making a change, you'll change one thing, see how that's worked, and then change something else, see how that works, and then change something else. If you change too much at once, it can backfire, and actually you don't really know what's worked, what hasn't worked, and can create a bit of a mess for some teams.
absolutely. Yeah, big fan of that. I think even just looking at ways you might follow a process or a framework, say like Scrum, but then there might be granular things around how you do things, and try something in isolation if you are going to experiment to see if it works or not, because otherwise it sort of muddies the water, and it's more confusing for everyone.
And one of the things you mentioned there was XP. So if people haven't come across XP before, what is it and how have you used it?
Extreme programming was one of the original methodologies, wasn't it, of Agile? So what's become good software craftsmanship now. So I think it led us with a lot of practices. It was the first thing that started to talk about really how customers, the business and IT shouldn't be at polar opposite ends, but it came at it through like a very sort of strong software lens. I don't think how old it is now. I'm sure it was back in the 90s when Kent Beck came up with it. But what stemmed from that were a lot of practices such as test-driven development, what was continuous integration, and has often then evolved now into a lot of modern day continuous delivery practices, and things like pair programming, which we sort of take for granted now, just as a healthy practice. So yeah, I think combining some of these almost like core software craftsmanship, core engineering, healthy, effective ways of working with a framework such as Scrum can be really effective. I think probably what's often forgotten is that it was also a bit of a way of working, though, in itself. It actually led us, people forget to use the stories that we seem to just, I think, associate now with things like Scrum.
So I guess we do, and I mean the thing with user stories is that I keep coming across different organisations, different teams, and people who just fundamentally get the concept wrong and treat user stories just as requirements. But there's so much more than that. So I mean, what in your view makes a great user story?
Yeah, I see that too. By the way, and I think starting with room for basic understanding of who wants something, what they want it for, and why is it delivering value. But that can come without the acceptance criteria, but leaving room for the team to have a discussion. So I think something that sets that out in plain English. There's also myths around user stories are technical, but absolutely not. There should be technical tasks that are really defining the granularity of often the engineering work that goes into deliver those stories, but something that anyone can understand in a value. It's got independent, you can verify and test it easily to be able to sign it off when it's done, when it's ready as well. I think teams probably should come up with their own definitions, because again, like methodologies and adopting things, I think teams' own definition of ready might have something that's contextual and tailored to their organization. So being able to define when something is ready for development in that organization, it is often something that varies organization to organization, and probably shouldn't be a universal thing just because every organization is different.
So I think one thing you said there about the user story, which I think is really important, is that it's a discussion. And I think the thing that for me really differentiates a story from a requirement is that it's designed to elicit a conversation. It's about putting an engineer into the place of the customer and allowing them to really understand what it is the customer is trying to achieve as a result of doing this bit of work, and actually you can almost spark the right questions and the right conversation across the team as to what the output of this needs to be, what the tangible value is that we're trying to deliver. But when you compare that to a traditional requirement, you can have requirements that are not customer centric. You can have requirements that the system will do something, but requirements don't always answer that question of why. Whereas for me, the user story is all about the why are we trying to do this.
Absolutely, yeah. So the conversation there is important because it's the collaboration. I think a lot of feedback I've had from engineers using stories, say, versus remember like the old school, the 100, 200 page BRD document. They create that understanding. They create empathy. So engineers like I think effective engineers like to be able to very good engineering craft, but they also like to understand the empathy for the people and who they're creating and crafting that experience for. Be able to understand user needs. They can then make coding decisions that lead to a better overall experience.
And I guess that's about coming forward with a problem statement, right? Engineers fundamentally at heart are problem solvers and like to resolve problems. And therefore, if you bring forward all of the solutions or the requirements, as it were, it leaves precious little thinking time for engineers to actually come back with value. Whereas actually in a user story, you've got that opportunity to really solve the problem and understand, what problem we're trying to solve for the person who needs the solution.
Absolutely, yeah. So you might think of also just by having the conversation as well. You may drive out workarounds and different edge cases. Also I think we've found with our engineers and our sort of cross-functional teams being involved earlier in the process, say with user researchers or service designers, they're also thinking about important things like how we can make software, via a product or a service, more inclusive as well. So I think like taking that further left and that collaborative approach of, it's not just, the old school, like let's leave a BA for 3 months to write this big document to throw it over the fence. Yeah, it's that that collaboration. And I think you get that as well. Like we're sort of increasingly aware and wanting to do more and improve in terms of like diversity and inclusion at Nimble. And I think that this sort of plays into that a little bit more, that you've got diverse teams and but just in a, I guess, different role sense here, where people from different roles collaborating may solve problems in different ways, come at them from different angles. And you should have that, that healthy discussion that will flush out things and also, get a lot of unknowns out of people's heads.
I think you're right. People think differently, right, in different roles. An engineer will think differently to somebody who's in a product organization, who will think differently to an ops person. And actually, that cross-functional team approach that you're talking about, it's so important. I mean, I've worked in organizations that have a lot of silos, where you've got teams that are working in isolation. They aren't really talking in the right way. But actually, by creating a single team where you bring together all disciplines, from product, from engineering, from ops, into one central place, it's so powerful, because suddenly you have engineers understanding the problem from somebody else's perspective. It's that whole thing about walking a mile in another person's shoes, which really builds empathy.
Absolutely, yeah. I was just going to say, back to that first empathy point there, that understanding, and I think it, I guess, and that's more fulfilling, right? Because I think an effective engineer, will want to create a usable solution that's met users' needs. I think that's becoming more and more prominent, and certainly has been in the public sector. But there is more movement towards that user-centered design experience as well in the private sector. Which is pleasing to see.
So we've talked a lot there about sort of agile principles, and why all of that thinking is really good, and and is good for organizations to do. But from my experience, organizations really seem to struggle with it. They really struggle to adopt some of the principles and to really transform to become agile organizations. Why do you think organizations have such difficulty with it?
I think there's a few, depending on the organization. I think you mentioned some organizations, been established quite a while and set in ways, often may have processes and governance that's a lot heavier and bloated. I think trying something new that feels, I guess, lighter touch, may be a source of like discomfort. It may feel like that a safety net's been taken away. Also, I think certain cultures, organizations that maybe aren't as agile in their mindset, in their values and principles, may have some sort of cultural anti-patterns, I guess, with I guess more bloated structures and silos, can lead to some sort, empire building, and therefore a cultural change to go from almost having this rule with an iron fist, command and control type of organization and culture to something that is more collaborative and empowers people more, I guess can, without even them realizing it, sometimes make people feel threatened as well. So I think they can sometimes, be barriers that you see.
I think there's definitely something about where the decision-making power lies within the organization, and that idea that maybe a quite historic idea that command and control. We're going to make the decision as part of senior management. We're going to define what we're going to do, and we're going to pass that down to the troops. I think that does cause some issues from an agile construct, because the essence of being agile and of being nimble and being able to to iterate quickly is that teams are empowered to make their own decisions and can make their own choices based upon what they believe is the right thing to do for the product at the time. And not all decisions can feasibly be elevated up to senior management, and arguably nor should they be, because actually your senior managers often are not the people who are closest to the customer and are closest to what the customers actually need or want.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think there's a lot to be said for sort of starting small as well. I think you see a lot of organizations that maybe struggle to adopt that, but there's often a lot of cultural shaping, cultural change that happens, and it is an enabler for this way of working to be effective. And I think but they may at the same time, even though that's almost I feel it is a fact, almost a true statement, they will start with a massive transformation that we're starting this tomorrow and there's 30 teams going to be affected, whereas actually I think being able to start small, an area that's sort of a bit warmed up to it and primed and raring to go, that proof of concept mentality, almost try something, start small, have the regular feedback loops, figure out like you would with delivering a product, say what's working and what isn't, and be able to iterate on that, be able to pivot and change maybe some of the things that don't work in the new ways of working with a handful of teams or one department that's got a few areas, whether that's a tribe, whatever, product group, handful of teams, but not 30 at once. There's something to be said about taking learnings from that. There's something to be said about, being able to do show and tells on your actual ways of working to other, maybe more skeptical areas of the organization that might be, less keen to adopt new ways of working, allow them to, have Q&As and be able to get that assurance and see that they are using that way of working and positive things are happening. Get them to be honest about it as well, about challenges. But I think there's a lot to be said about, being able to learn something in a smaller environment, but then be able to, as an enabler almost, to effectively roll it out on a larger scale. All change with so many teams from day one is, putting himself at more risk, but you still see it happen time and time again.
And I think at the heart of so much of what you're talking about there really is trust, and the ability for organizations to trust teams to make the right decisions for the organization. And I think it's something that I've seen in a number of different organizations. You kind of go through planning cycles. So maybe you go through a 3-year planning cycle, and you kind of you work out, well, what does the market want and what does the market need, and when are we going to kind of be able to deliver that, and when are we going to be able to do it, or whatever. And you kind of make these big investment decisions and decide you're going to spend many millions of pounds doing some of these things. And I mean, the money is huge, right? I mean, some organizations might be investing significantly in the development of some of these digital products, and then you're having the confidence to be able to push into a team and say, hey, we want to do this, or we want to we want you to implement something, but you know what, you make the right call, you're closest to the customer, you're closest to the problem statement, you do what you think is best. That's a very difficult thing for senior management to do, to let go of that responsibility and pass that responsibility into a team of what might be comparatively very junior people within the organization, but they might still be the best people to make the decision.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think you're essentially defining there, you're like the management mentality as opposed to leadership. So I think it works most effectively, and how they can get better is when that leadership mentality is adopted, i.e. that, they may set a vision, but then empower and trust, their individuals, the people who are at the right level and have the accuracy to make those decisions, but back them, and that leadership mentality also being removing obstacles and roadblocks for them, but letting them figure out the how. Often there is that, I guess, older school management mentality of, saying this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. And therefore, by doing that, you're stifling creativity, you're not giving, space for people to feel empowered and free and open, to be their best self. So I think there's a lot to be said for adopting that more leadership over management mentality there. I think the best transformations I've sort of seen doing this, where there's been that very visible leadership backing on the ground. So they're not interfering too much in how to do it and making every decision, but there's almost a PR element there, with the rest of the organization that being visibly backed. There's frequent messaging, there's somebody who has got the ability to remove these roadblocks to clear the way for for this sort of new way of working, to be given a proper chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know you're one of the things that your company's really keen on promoting, and something I know you like to talk about a lot is user-centered design and design thinking. I mean, if that's a concept people maybe haven't heard of, maybe you can just give us a bit of an introduction to what design thinking really is.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think with user-centered design, so often, like, I guess you'd see now a lot in the say the private sector. There's a lot talking about product design, which is thinking about visual design, and also sort of how a screen might be laid out, how a journey would be, crafted into end to end to make it intuitive. User-centered design, so there's a real sort of strong emphasis on design end-to-end services that solve whole problems. So you may have different user journeys in using a product or a service, within a product or a service, and also they may have multiple touch points with other journeys and dependencies between each other. There may also be activities a user needs to carry out that's what we call service design, which is whether the activity they need to call out is just completing a task, but it's on or off screen. There's a real focus on crafting something that meets the needs of a user, and that's what user-centered design sets out to do.
Yeah, and one of the ways that certainly we've used to kind of get a customer's head kind of into that space and to really kind of think about what the user wants to achieve is the concept of a Google design sprint. I think you've used those before in some of your projects as well, which is a really good way of really kind of getting a product out there fast. You're iterating and learning what kind of users think about it, without necessarily always thinking that the product has to be perfect. You actually go into a prototype mindset. How's your experience of using that approach?
Really, really effective. I guess I guess for those who don't know, it's still fairly recent. Adopted approach. I was going to say 5 years. I guess it. Someone may correct me and say it's been as near as 10 now, which is probably because we've just lost the last 2 years. I think particularly the public sector welcomes that a lot in the GDS phases in alphas. Where we're setting some a hypothesis. We are what we think a user needs, and we're saying if we do this and we design something, we think this behavior will happen and it'll meet some user needs. We'll quickly develop some low fidelity wireframes or prototypes that we can get in front of a user in a handful of days, and then set them a task to complete, that we normally record. We call this activity usability testing, and then we'd sort of monitor the behaviors, body language, visual cues, where they're clicking on a screen, and be able to tell if what we've designed has met their needs, essentially. So you'll get a lot of cues there from there's something that's really not in that's counterintuitive, in where we've put a button or a navigation. You'll often record this activity as well with their permission, of course, as well. We'll ask questions at the end, but really important that we don't lead the user during that activity, so that it's a pure test, really.
And a lot of this thinking comes out of a book called Sprint, which is well worth a read if people haven't read it. I personally find, I've used the process, when you're kicking off a new project or a new product development, it's a great way to get everybody up to speed, to learn what we're actually trying to achieve, and to get people really into that MVP mindset. The idea of bringing together multiple stakeholders from across the organization, getting some input around, what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, where we're going with the product. Then getting all the team to ideate again really quickly, kind of coming up with ideas for how we can approach the problem space, how we can resolve the problem, how we can how we can really meet a user need, and then crucially getting that user feedback. And the 5-day process always amazes me. How at the end of the week you
Yeah.
can learn so much from real users. And actually, in some cases, I've run the process, and we've got to the end of the week, we've got some feedback from users, and thought, well, that product's never going to work. Clearly, we're on the wrong track, and the whole thing's been scrapped. And in other cases, we found things that have been hugely successful and have actually kind of steered the direction of a product development for the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
But isn't it much better to find out the answers to whether or not it's something we should back and is going to be a winner after 5 days, rather than spinning up a project that's going to have many hundreds of thousands or even millions of pounds invested into it, and not get those customer learnings until the very end, when you might realize that actually you'd made a big mistake. So you spent your money before you realize it's a mistake, or you spend 5 days, realize it's a mistake, and you haven't lost very much at all.
Yeah, you reduce the risk massively, don't you? So that cycle, idea, build, launch, learn. The feedback loop is so tiny, isn't it, compared to even like the I guess a mini, some small MVP. We're still talking a week and not 3 months, right? So I think what's also been really powerful as well, and I think we've sort of had a lot of collaboration of late, and only going to dial this up still with our engineers, is things like getting them engineering mindset involved in this process. So doing design walkthroughs before we take something to user testing, where engineers can feedback on prototypes and sketches to tell us what is and isn't technically feasible. Also doing things like co-design ideation workshops, so everyone on the team can do lo-fi sketches based on user insights to basically generate as many ideas as possible to solve a problem. But it's just trying to take that mentality now. We're talking about cross-functional teams earlier on, where we're wanting to adopt that. Started in the public sector with the whole like user research is a team sport movement, but really taking that mentality and the ongoing and last 15 years of my career, this cross-functional team mentality to take this user-centered design as a team sport. Let's take it a step further and get that engineering mindset akin to Agile, so multidisciplinary teams can have understanding, empathy, and solve problems effectively, but yeah, as you say, in a very short space of time.
So, Chris, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. If people have liked what you've been talking about and maybe want to get in touch, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. So I think they'd be able to get in touch with me by getting in touch on LinkedIn, or actually contacting me via the Nimble page on LinkedIn. Also on Twitter at Chris Roberts UK, or at Nimble Approach on there as well.
Fabulous. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure talking to you tonight. Thank you for joining me and sharing all of your experience and all of your best practice around your Agile adoptions and Agile transformation. And I'm sure we'll get to chat to you at some point again in the future. Thanks very much.
No, that's great, Steve. Thanks for inviting me. Enjoyed it thoroughly, mate. Cheers.
Chris's experience of helping organizations with agile transformations provides a really great perspective on how to approach modern software delivery at scale. I was also really interested to hear about how Nimble Approach user-centered design thinking to set projects up for success. You've been listening to The Engineering Leader, a weekly podcast where I chat to people working within the software engineering community, helping us to collectively share best practice and raise the bar to build better software product for our customers. If you're enjoying listening, please remember to press the subscribe button within your favourite podcast player, and also please subscribe on YouTube. You can also let me know what you think by searching Steve Westgarth on LinkedIn, or tweet me at Steve Westgarth on Twitter. In the meantime, remember, we all write bad code. If you disagree, you may as well switch off. My name is Steve Westgarth, and this is The Engineering Leader.